Chapter 228 of JJK has reached a crucial turning point in the battle between Sukuna and Gojo. And I think most importantly out of this entire chapter, Sukuna finally uses a technique that we've been waiting for him to use this entire fight. But before I get ahead of myself, if you guys remember in the previous chapter, Gojo had used his domain expansion for the third time. But this time he expanded it far enough to engulf several buildings and then shrunk it to a size smaller than a basketball. Well, we pick up immediately after this in the next chapter. Well, Kusakabe mentions that this should be impossible for like the 10th time already. He's pretty much calling everything that happens in this fight impossible. But Maki wonders why it's so surprising if the size of a domain on the inside is usually much bigger than how it appears on the outside, which is, you know, a pretty easy line of logic, right? It would make sense that the outward appearance of a domain really doesn't matter if the inside is always much bigger than it really is. Well, Kusakabe rebukes this and says what's most important with barrier techniques is a concrete image. Usually if you try to envision a barrier too small to even hold yourself and your opponent, the barrier would collapse. So he's pretty much saying that it's supposed to be impossible to create a domain expansion smaller than yourself. Well, Choso comes in with some really good insight on why he can do this, because he mentions that Gojo's time in the prison realm made it much easier for Gojo to understand how to do this, because the prison realm is this tiny little cube and Gojo was locked in this space for some time. So it would make sense that he learned a thing or two from it and implemented it into his own domain expansion. But Kusakabe still wonders how he could just change the conditions of his domain so quickly, and he elaborates, domain barriers typically have set internal and external parameters like volume and creation speed. By discovering their own blend of these parameters, every sorcerer is able to establish their own domain barrier. And Higuruma and Hikari are both surprised by this, but Kusakabe lets them know that they're exceptions to this rule because their domains are predicated on their curse technique. They're one and the same pretty much. So essentially what Kusakabe is trying to hammer home here is that once a sorcerer kind of sets the conditions to their domain, that's pretty much how it stays. Think of it like a recipe for making any type of food, like bread or anything. There's pretty much one way to do it, right? Like the cooking time has to be exactly the same, the temperature that you're cooking it has to be exactly the same, the measurements of the ingredients, etc. If you mess up any of those details, you're not going to get the thing that you were looking to make. So essentially what Gojo and Sukuna are doing is mixing up all of the ingredients that it takes to make bread or something and still getting the same result, which, as he keeps pointing out, should be impossible. But as he says, Hikari and Higuruma are exceptions to this because their domain is tied to their curse technique. So it's something that they kind of just do inherently. They don't really have to think about setting certain conditions or parameters or anything. It kind of just comes to whenever they use their curse technique. Well, Yuta points out that Sukuna seems to have also decreased his domain range so he could increase the output of his curse technique, meaning he started to adjust Malevolent Shrine to increase the output of it. Well, just like that, the domain shatters for the third freaking time. Doesn't seem like Gojo can catch a break here, or at least it seems that way, because Malevolent Shrine also suddenly starts to crumble away as well. And in the next panel we find out why. It's because Sukuna got a massive blow dealt to him by Gojo. It seems like he has some kind of hole in his chest or something. So apparently at the same time Sukuna destroyed Gojo's domain, but Gojo countered by dealing enough damage to where he couldn't maintain his domain either. Well, to us the readers it seems like all of this happened in an instant, but Mei clarifies that they were in there for 3 minutes from the moment that the domain shrunk. Well, seeing as how both domains fighters have been destroyed now, Higuruma points out that now neither of them can use their curse techniques. Well, Maki points out the obvious, that Gojo can just use reverse curse technique to heal his own curse technique, which you would think would put him in an advantage over Sukuna, but apparently Sukuna is so much of a genius that he can pretty much learn how to replicate or copy any technique he sees by just seeing it once. Angel explains that with Kenjaku's help, Sukuna was able to split his spirit into 20 cursed objects, which were the fingers, and after seeing it just once, he learned how to do it to turn himself into a cursed object. And of course what he's referring to is when he transferred his soul into Yuji's pinky just before making Megumi swallow it. So that kind of sucks. Sukuna can pretty much use reverse curse technique to heal his curse technique just like Gojo can now. Well, they start trading blows again, and Gojo manages to land a kick that backs him off quite a bit, but then Gojo starts wondering to himself, this whole time Sukuna's been stubbornly avoiding using any other curse technique other than the one granted to his domain. Even when the interior strength of the barrier lowered after I flipped the internal and external conditions, he didn't try to destroy from the inside. He chose the riskier option. And he continues wondering and says, in fact, until my domain was destroyed from the outside, I had the upper hand for 3 minutes. In spite of all that, why didn't Sukuna even try to use the 10 Shadows technique or Maharaga inside the domain? Sukuna has the memory of Megumi in my conversation, so he knows I know about Maharaga, doesn't he? Is he scared I'll beat it with a single attack? And in the next panel we get the bombshell of the chapter when we see Maharaga's Dharma Chakra wheel turn a click. And this alone raises a ton of questions, because Gojo obviously knew something was up, considering the fact that Sukuna had several opportunities to use the 10 Shadows technique and not let Gojo deal all the damage that he did. So it isn't clearly stated exactly what's going on with this wheel, but it seems to be implied that it's been out this entire time, or at the very least, as soon as Gojo shrunk his domain, or else the wheel wouldn't have anything to adapt to, right? Well, it is possible that Sukuna might have been using the wheel since the very beginning of the fight, and it wouldn't make a ton of sense because he did use domain amplification before this, so he technically shouldn't have been able to use it at the time. But again, in the previous chapter, Sukuna just used domain amplification and his domain expansion at the same time, which was seen to be impossible, so if anyone could justifiably have an ass pull like this come out, it would be Sukuna. Well, aside from this, it was never really specified if the wheel would adapt against someone's curse technique in general, like any application of it, because if that were the case, all it needed to do was adapt to Gojo's Limitless, and just like that, it's immune to blue, red, and hollow purple. I kind of hope that that isn't the case, because that would be way too broken. But even if it does have to individually adapt to each technique, if Sukuna used the wheel at the very beginning of the fight, it's pretty much adapted to all the moves that we know Gojo has to this point, because he's used blue, he's used red, he used hollow purple at the very beginning, and he's used his domain expansion. So if it's been adapting to all of these things, then that's pretty much it, unless Gojo pulls out some new moves that we haven't seen yet, some stuff that he's developed while he was in the prison realm. He doesn't really have much he can do now. Now, like I said, it's purposely left vague exactly how long this wheel's been turning and how it's been hidden from Gojo this entire time, but either way, it's just not good news for Gojo. Gojo's definitely taken some L's in the back and forth fight these past couple chapters, but this is by far the biggest one, because it leaves Gojo potentially not being able to use anything against Sukuna that's effective. I don't think Gojo's gonna die in the next chapter, but at the very least, I think in 229, we're gonna see Gojo get pushed to the brink and come closer to death than he ever has before.